All right, good afternoon and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the NCCOR Connect and Explore webinar. We have a fantastic program for you today. Our spotlight today is going to be on the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. And after we hear from our speakers, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, and then we'll close with a few announcements from NCCOR. Let me go ahead and introduce the folks on our webinar to you today. First, I'm your moderator, Karen Hilliard. Let me introduce you to our presenters now. Our first two presenters will be Dr. Frances Fleming and Dr. Jennifer Harris, both from the University of Connecticut Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. After their presentation, we will then hear from Dr. Mary Muth from RTI International. During the webinar, we will have, as I mentioned, an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, please write it using the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. If you need any technical assistance during the webinar, please let us know. You can let us know using the chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom toolbar. And if you're having trouble logging into the webinar, please email us at ncor@fhi360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. Again, to ask any questions, we would please ask that you use the Q&A box rather than the chat. So look for the Q&A box, and that is where we will be answering all of our questions from at the end of the speaker presentations. I wanted to let you know that we are also going to be tweeting today's webinar from NCCOR's Twitter account. And if you'd like to join that conversation, you can use the hashtag ConnectExplore. So we'd like to first, though, open today's webinar with a couple of questions for all of you in the audience. We have an interactive poll. We'll go ahead and put the first poll question up here, actually both poll questions up here on the screen, and you can respond to these. The first question is, prior to today's webinar, were you aware of the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative? Yes or no? And then secondly, we would like to know from all of you how you would categorize your role in this discipline on this issue. So are you a practitioner, a researcher, a student, or would you categorize yourself as something other than that? So please go ahead and indicate your answers there. We'll give everyone just a moment to respond, and then we will share with you who else is in the audience. So let's give everybody a moment. And if you haven't already responded, please go ahead and do that. I will count down just to give everybody an opportunity to answer the question if possible. We've got a big crowd here today and we want to know a little something about you. So let's go ahead and close this out in 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see the answers. All right, so we can see from today's poll that that a lot of folks on the webinar were not previously aware of the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. So that's great. You're going to be getting a lot of good information today. And for those of you who had already heard of it or were familiar with it, I know you're going to come away from today's webinar with some new information that you'll be able to share with other people. And it looks like, as we look across the audience, that we've got a really good mix here of practitioners and researchers. About a fifth of you are practitioners, a little more than that are researchers, and about 11% of the folks in the audience are students. And then we've got a group of other folks. And so if you want to let us know in the chat what your other roles are, that would be great. We would love to know more about the work that you do so that we can tailor, especially the Q&A later on, to your needs as an audience, and may be able to tailor some of what is said in the presentations as well to help some of you with the work that you do. All right, well, fantastic, and thank you for that. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get on with our program. So first up in the spotlight, let me introduce to you Dr. Frances Fleming.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. First, I'm going to give an overview of the CFBAI, and then I'm going to tell you the goals of the study that we conducted and published in 2017. And then I'll be turning it over to Jennifer Harris to give us the results of the research and also the conclusions. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to acknowledge our funder and co-authors of the study, and then also to show you where you can find the full report at the bottom of the screen there. Next slide, please. So in 2006, the Institute of Medicine conducted research and published a report. And the conclusions were that food advertising, food marketing to children harms their health. In response, the Better Business Bureau created the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative in 2006, and it was fully implemented by the end of the year of 2007. When it started, 11 companies were participating. And by 2016, when we were doing our research, 18 companies were participating. I believe it might be 19 right now. These companies pledged to advertise only healthier dietary choices in child-directed media. Next slide, please. So the lists of these products, these brands and products that are allowed to be on child-directed media are regularly published online. And the products, well, as of actually 2013, the products must meet these category-specific uniform nutrition criteria. Just to note that this nutrition criteria is established by the CFBAI and not really any other body. But at the time of our research, there were 10 product categories, and the list, how you could make it to the list was based on certain nutrients to limit and ingredients to encourage. And then there were also these exempt products, meaning that they could be advertised in child-directed television or media without having to meet the criteria that was listed. So they're considered exempt products. Next slide, please. And we looked at CFBAI for over 10 years. We knew the limitations of CFBAI, but we conducted our research to be able to really demonstrate the limitations of CFBAI. And that includes their definition of child-directed advertising and their definition of healthier dietary choices. As I mentioned earlier, what they choose or what they consider is appropriate for child-directed TV is based on their own nutrition criteria. Also voluntary participation and how that's an issue. And that fact that the CFBAI only covers children ages 2 to 11. Next slide, please.
So I'm just going to give a little bit more background on the different, back, please. The previous slide, please. Yeah, talk a little bit more about those limitations and loopholes that, that Fran mentioned. So the first loophole, if you look at the number one circle up in the right, is that the CFBAI only applies to companies that voluntarily participate. So there's a large number of companies that advertise to children that don't participate. Chuck E. Cheese's and Topps Candy are the top examples of that. And so they continue to advertise directly to children. The second major loophole is that the CFBAI only applies to advertising on child-directed media, which is basically children's television or any television that is primarily viewed by mostly children. So, so companies can, even participating companies can continue to advertise any products to children on other kinds of media, things like social media or general audience programming or even family programming where children are watching with other people in the audience. So that's the number 2 loophole. Then another loophole is related to that list of products that can be advertised to children that Fran mentioned. And so companies put products on the list that meet the nutrition criteria, but they only need to list a small number of their products on that list to advertise. So a brand, for example, like Lunchables has over 40 different kinds of products. They only list 2 or 3 on their CFBAI list. So those are the products that are advertised to children on children's television. But then they have a lot of other products that aren't shown in their ads that don't meet their nutrition standards. And then the final loophole is that they can just show a logo. So this happens a lot in digital media. For example, Lunchables could just show a Lunchables logo on a children's website, and that would be okay according to the CFBAI. So next slide. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go into the findings on our in our report specifically, and I'm going to talk today about television because we have the best data on what's going on television, and also that still remains the majority of companies spending. They spend more than 90% of their ad budgets on television. So what do we find happened from 2007 when the CFBAI was implemented to 2016? Well, we did find that food advertising on children's television went down by quite a bit, by 45%, for both preschoolers and children 6 to 11 years old. So they're seeing fewer ads on children's television. And the dark blue is the CFBAI participating companies. So most of that decline was from companies that participate in the program. Next slide. But children continued to see a lot of food ads on children's television, on average 3.5. Every child in the US saw 3.5 per day in 2016. Next slide. But what happened on other kinds of television is food advertising went way up. So both preschoolers and children saw a lot more ads on other types of programming, not children's programming, in 2016 than they saw in 2017. The CFBAI company ads stayed relatively flat, but the non-participating company advertising went way up. Next slide, please. So overall, there was a slight decline in food ads viewed per day, from 12.3 in 2007 to 11 in 2016. Next slide, please. But that decline can't only be attributed to the implementation of the children's food and beverage advertising, because during the same time period, children spent a lot less time watching commercial television. So because they were watching less television, they were being exposed to fewer ads on television. Next slide. And in fact, what happened during that time is there were more food ads per hour of viewing. So the number of food ads when they were watching an hour actually increased over that period of time. Next slide. This chart shows what we found in terms of the nutrition quality of the products that were advertised by CFBAI companies on children's television. And we looked at other nutrition standards that could be applied. For example, do they meet the criteria for smart snacks that could be sold in schools, or an overall nutrition profiling score that we use. And basically what we found is that except for yogurts, most of the other products would not meet other nutrition standards and could not be sold or served to children in schools. So they were the products, the CFBAI nutrition criteria were not as strict as other nutrition standards. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned the issue of brands that could show one or two products that were healthier in their TV ads, but still offer a lot of other products for within the same brand. So a brand like Lunchables or Capri Sun, which are both Kraft Heinz brands, actually had more products in their portfolio than more than half of the products in their portfolio could not be advertised to children. So they could advertise, for example, Capri Sun juice, but not Capri Sun fruit drinks. But most people, when they think of Capri Sun, think of the fruit drinks. Next slide. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have the issue of companies that don't participate in the CFBAI. And I mentioned Chuck E. Cheese's and Tops before as companies that advertise on children's television, but do not belong to the program. And actually, children saw more ads for Chuck E. Cheese's than for any other product on children's television. Next slide. And then there are a lot of products that children see advertising for that don't appear on children's television. And here the fast food restaurants are really the top advertisers that kids see ads for. Next slide. So the bottom line is from 2007 to 2016, the first 10 years of CFBAI, not much changed. You can see the picture of products that are advertised to children on television is almost the same as the products that were advertised 10 years earlier. And we didn't find any evidence that companies weren't keeping to their pledges, what they promised to do, but the loopholes just made those pledges not very meaningful. The next slide. And so finally, I just want to end with a few of our recommendations coming out of our report in 2017. The first was that the CFBAI nutrition standard should align with the 2015 DGAs. And since then, they have improved their nutrition standards. And Mary will show you what happened after they improved their nutrition standards. So that was some progress. But the companies really need to make sure that all of the products offered by brands that are advertised to children meet nutrition standards. Non-participating companies should join self-regulation, especially if they're advertising a lot to children, and at least establish company policies about advertising unhealthy foods to children. And finally, if the food companies won't make these changes, the media companies could set their own standards. For example, Disney has nutrition standards for any food products that are advertised during its children's programming, and they're much stricter than the food industry standards. And then I didn't talk about this a lot, but as you may have noticed on the numbers, preschoolers, children under 6 are seeing just about as many ads as children over 6. And that really is taking advantage of a very vulnerable population. And so they should be protected at a greater extent even than younger children. And thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer and Fran. So I'll sort of be picking up a little bit from where Jennifer and Fran left off with some more recent updates and some work that we did at RTI International. Before I get started, I would like to thank, next slide. I'd like to thank the Healthy Eating Research Program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for providing funds for this research. I'd also like to acknowledge Joanne Guthrie at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service for advising on the study and coordinating access to the IRI Consumer Network household purchase data. But I also need to add a disclaimer that findings and conclusions are those of the authors and not be construed to represent any USDA or government policy. I also want to acknowledge Sean Carnes at RTI, who conducted much of the analysis with the household purchase and nutrition data. We have two publications from this work that are posted. One is a research brief with the Healthy Eating Research Program, and another is the more detailed research report that's posted on the RTI webpage. Next slide. So Fran and Jennifer have already provided some background on CFBAI, so I won't go into too much detail on its history. For our analysis, we focus on the part of the criteria for nutrition components to limit, particularly calories, saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars, and total added sugars. However, I also wanted to note that the criteria also have requirements for nutrition components to encourage, such as fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and calcium. We focus our analysis on the changes in the criteria that were announced in 2018 and went into effect in January 1st of 2020, which Jennifer mentioned previously. CFBAI chose January 1st, 2020, because it was the date that most companies had to comply with changes required by FDA on the nutrition facts label. We used 2017 then as the baseline to compare changes so that our baseline is before the announcement of the new criteria. Next slide. Our analysis focused on two main research questions. First, what is the public health significance of products on the CFBAI list, and did it change under the 2020 criteria? And second, what is the effect of similar substitute products produced by the same manufacturers but not included on the CFBAI list? I'll talk a little bit more about substitute products in a minute, but essentially they are products that are similar to listed products for which consumers could readily substitute. In the Red Center work, these are typically referred to as non-listed products. It's basically the same concept as the non-listed products. And when we talk about public health significance, we mean how much the products could potentially affect the diets of households with children. Next slide. So the goals of our study can be divided into three parts. And for this work, we focused on households with children 0 to 8 years of age, given the focus of the Healthy Eating Research Program. First, in our baseline analysis, we looked at how much the listed products contributed to calories, saturated fat, sugar, fiber, and sodium in foods purchased by households with children in 2017 in our baseline. Second, we looked at the changes by looking at how much the contributions would have changed if products that were on the 2017 list had been reformulated to meet the new criteria. And finally, for substitute products, we looked at the relative importance of similar substitute products or unlisted products in 2017. I also want to note a similar analysis was conducted and published by the Federal Trade Commission in 2020. And they used data from 2009 that they gathered from food manufacturers. So that was prior to the establishment of uniform criteria by CFBAI, but conceptually is very similar to the work that we did. Next slide. So to provide a bit more context, context, food manufacturers that have listed products that were included in our analysis are shown on the left. The companies on the right also participate in CFBAI, but they do not engage in child-directed advertising for their products. Therefore, they have no listed products. A new list of products that meet the criteria is generated each year due to changes in product offerings and product formulation. Next slide. To show you an example of the criteria, here are the criteria we focused on for main dishes and entrees. So an example of a main dish or entree would be kids' cuisine frozen meals produced by ConAgra. In this category, there were no required changes due to the change in the criteria for saturated fat, but limits for sodium decreased from 600 milligrams per serving to 570 per listed serving size. For sugars, the criteria were stated in terms of total sugars, and in 2020 they were stated in terms of added sugars, and that's to correspond to the changes in how sugars were listed on the nutrition facts label. So they're not directly, the 15 grams of total sugars is not directly comparable to the 9 grams of added sugars in 2020. So the limits for calories did not change, but in our analysis, we calculated implied changes in calories if the amount of added sugars changed. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention here too, there are about, now there are more product categories than in the analysis that Jennifer and Fran talked about. There are about 14 in total. There are also some product categories for which there are no listed products. And those are, you can see those in the list that's generated each year by CFBAI. Next slide, please. Now I'll give a brief overview of the data we used in the analysis. So we used household-based scanner data from IRI, which is a commercial market research company. The data comprise all purchases and prices paid by a panel of households over the course of the year. From that data, we extracted data to focus on purchases made by households with children 0 to 8 years of age, and we segmented it by income, race, and ethnicity. For the nutrition label data that we matched up to the purchase data, we used the IRI data, but we also supplemented it with some data that was provided to us by the Red Center, and we also used USDA's branded food products database. Because the original criteria for sugars were for total rather than added sugars, and only total sugars were on the label in 2017 in our data, we developed and applied an algorithm to determine the amount of added sugars in 2017 in each product. That algorithm is documented as an appendix in our report if it's of interest. Next slide, please. So in the scanner data for 2017, we identified all of the individual products at the barcode level that were listed, resulting in almost 700 individual products. So that includes all different package sizes of the listed products at the barcode level. On a percentage basis, listed products comprise slightly more than 1% of calories, about 1% of sodium, but only 0.5% of saturated fat, more for added sugars, 1.3%, and 1.6% of dietary fiber. So the way we calculated this was to add up all of the nutrients in the foods that were purchased by households, weighted to a national estimate, and then divided that by average consumption values. And those average consumption values were from USDA's What We Eat in America, which is based on the NHANES dietary recall data. So we calculated those the total consumption values according to the ages and genders of all the members of the households included in the analysis. So there are about 500,000 barcodes typically in the US in any given year. So for 1% of calories is actually a pretty high percentage for 700 products relative to the approximately 500,000 that are on the market. So this means that listed products have a high relative sales volume. Next slide, please. We then calculated how much the per person values would change if products were reformulated to meet the new criteria. So we based these calculations again on purchase volumes in 2017 for households with children 0 to 8 years. We found about 21% of products would have had to have been reformulated to meet the limits for calories, saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium. So that does not include products that might have needed to be reformulated because of the nutrients, the requirements for nutrients to encourage. So to put the values in the table in context, the daily values in the dietary guidelines for Americans with children 4 to 8 years range from about 1,200 to 1,400 calories. So the 22 calories shown is relative to that 1,200 to 1,400 calories per day. The amount shown for saturated fat of 0.13 is relative to about 3 grams of saturated fat in the dietary guidelines for Americans. For sugars, 35 grams of added sugars, and for sodium, 1,500 milligrams. So when considering the percentage changes shown in the bottom row, due to potential reformulation, calories would decrease by slightly less than 1%, saturated fat by 0.2%, added sugars by more than 2%, and sodium by more than 1%. These changes were substantially driven by changes for yogurt products, exempt beverage, and sweet snacks. The amounts for fiber would have changed due to requirements for whole grains in some products, but we're not able to calculate that from the data we have. Also, in the report that we prepared, we show all of these results broken out by the different demographic groups. Next slide, please. Finally, we looked at the role of substitute products. So identifying all possible substitute products is challenging. We focused on trying to identify all of the other types and varieties of products with the same brand name as listed products. So we show some examples here. In total, we identified 818 products at the barcode level. And to emphasize what Jennifer just mentioned, why do we care about substitute products? The main reason is that if companies advertise listed products, the effects may spill over and increase purchases of less healthy unlisted products. So here we show some examples of those listed and unlisted products to just illustrate the difficulty there is in determining differences between the two. Next slide, please. So when comparing listed and substitute products, we find the following. So as I stated previously, we found more individual products at the barcode level for the substitute products. The relative sales volume is much higher for the substitute products, but the relative value of purchases is only slightly higher. So more units purchased, but somewhat more value of purchases. And these relative differences imply that substitute products have generally lower per unit prices, but those differences could also be due to differences in package size. Next slide, please. We also compared average price per serving for listed versus substitute products. So average price is calculated by dividing the total price paid of all purchases by the household by the total number of servings according to the listed serving size on the package. So the results show in general no general pattern in whether listed or substitute products were priced higher. Most of the differences were actually fairly small, with the exception of yogurt products, where substitute products had much higher average price per serving than listed products. Next slide, please. So summary of the results. So so to wrap up and summarize, for the baseline, we found 696 unique products at the barcode level, which comprise about 1% of calories, 0.5% of saturated fats, 1.3% of added sugars, and 1% of sodium, and 1.6% of dietary fiber in household purchases in the baseline. But in considering the effects of reformulation to meet the 2020 criteria, again, assuming that purchase volumes remain the same as in the baseline, about 21% of products would have needed to have been reformulated. And those reformulations would have resulted in about a 2.4% reduction in added sugars, 0.8% in calories, 1.2 of sodium relative to the baseline, which is fairly small. In looking at substitute products, we identified 818 substitute products, and these are obviously an important share of the product portfolios. We found no systematic differences in per serving prices for those products. And next slide. So for a few concluding comments, in general, based on our results, the public health significance of CFBAI is somewhat limited because few products are listed. Improved criteria helped, but the changes are still small, are still relative to a small baseline. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, allowing companies to advertise similar substitute products creates a loophole because advertising of listed products could spill over to unlisted products. CFBAI could consider requiring that all products in a brand family meet the criteria for advertising to children. But more generally, I also want to make the point that it is important to ensure that the design of these types of voluntary industry initiatives or self-regulation can result in a public health impact. Additional data resources on food purchases and consumption can be used in analyses to gain a better understanding of potential impacts to inform the design of these types of initiatives. These data include household scanner data, such as those used in this study, but also store scanner data. And those data can then also be matched up with nutrition label data and dietary recall data. So with that, we'll turn it over to questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. So much good information here. And we have about 10 or 12 minutes now for Q&A. So I want to invite anyone in the audience to go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A box. Please put them there and we will respond to as many of them as we can. We've already got some good questions coming through now. So let me go ahead and ask the first one, which goes to Jennifer. And that question is, what are the benefits for companies to join the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the timing of the introduction of the initiative is important because in 2006, the Institute of Medicine published a seminal book on the impact of unhealthy food advertising on children. And that started a very active public health dialogue. The FTC, the CDC, and the FDA started talking about possible limitations on food marketing to kids. And so one reason to establish the program was to ward off any government regulation. And then the other reason is for public relations value. So now companies that spend a lot of money advertising to children can say we belong to this program and we only advertise healthier dietary choices, which sounds great until you start going into the details as we've just presented, but for public health or for public relations purposes, it supports their ability to advertise to children.
Okay, thank you. We have a question now for Mary Muth, and that question is, could substitute products be store brand?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So, and I guess the way we define substitute products, those are products that are produced by the same manufacturers that participate in CFBAI. So it would not include store brands. In our particular case, we're concerned with advertising of the listed products that could spill over to products produced by the same manufacturer with the same brand. So in theory, yes, store brands are substitute products, but not in the way that we've defined them for this analysis.
Okay, excellent question. All right, another question now for Jennifer is, cartoons on cereal boxes, squeezable yogurt tubes, and interactive video games using products in the game all seem predatory and aimed at young children. What can be done to regulate these tactics?
I'm going to answer this one, Fran. It's actually a request that we've made to CFBAI before. If you look at all of the documentation about CFBAI, they talk about advertising and they limit what they're going to do to advertising. But we're concerned with marketing. Advertising is just a piece of that. And we know that it's very synergistic. So what's marketed in one way on TV ads, it's the same that's on packaging, and it's the same that's in other places. So we know and are concerned about marketing on packaging. We would like CFBAI to include that in their regulations to limit that type of marketing. We know that it's problematic because it appeals to children. It increases what is called pester power, pressure on parents to buy products that I think if you haven't experienced it yourself, you've heard about it or you've seen it when you've been out in the supermarkets, and we know that that's a problem.
Thank you. So we have a question now for Mary Muth, which is, do WIC food allowances specify the improved products as the choices that are allowed by the programs?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it actually brings up, I think, a very important point in that whether a product is a listed product is not communicated to consumers in any fashion. So it's not possible to see on a product label or on a product shelf that a product is a CFBA listed product. So there isn't really an avenue to specify that it's part of any sort of program like WIC. And so the only communication about whether a product is listed is in the published list that's a PDF document on the CFBA list, not communicated to consumers in any way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and for our first two presenters, another question, does any research exist on the impacts of the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative on children's exposure to food advertising online? And if not, is that an area that is currently being explored?
Yeah, that's a great question. In our report, we published the data on children's exposure to food ads online, to purchased advertising online, and also visits to websites. But the issue with digital marketing is there's a lot of exposure that is not trackable because it happens at the individual level. So So for example, social media is something that isn't tracked because kids share it virally with each other. And this is a research challenge that a lot of research groups are trying to figure out, because basically you need to track what a child is seeing on their actual device or PC to see what they're seeing, because it changes depending on their activity. So we're working on it. We're not quite there yet, though.
Okay. We've got a lot of other questions here, and so I'm going to try to work through as many of these as we can. I'm not sure which panelists will want to take this on, but let me ask this. Within the loopholes, is there a way to hold companies accountable to their pledges?
So that's a great question too. And I mean, that's the reason we do this kind of research, is to be able to publicize what the pledges mean and what they don't mean. And really, companies respond to public relations. So if they start getting backlash for what they're advertising to children, then we have seen that they will change. So that's why so many researchers and advocates are working on this issue, because just naming names is really important to get the companies to change.
Okay. Okay. And there's another question as well about what other countries are doing to limit advertising to children, and whether there's any evidence that limitations like this help with children's diet or their weight.
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit too. There are actually a few countries that have regulations on both advertising and marketing to children. For the UK, and does not allow unhealthy foods to be advertised to children online or in television. There's not a lot of research to show how that affects children's diets. Children's diets is a very long way from watching television. So it's hard to show that a change in advertising exposure when there's so much advertising surrounding kids overall, how one change in one media is going to affect their diets. But you know, that is being, we are trying to figure out how to do that. I mean, I would also say that in Latin America, countries have started, Chile in particular, now does not allow child-directed marketing on product packages for unhealthy products. So Tony the Tiger can't be on Frosted Flakes anymore in Chile. And they're combining that with warning labels for high sugar, fat, and calories and sodium. So those kinds of initiatives that include several different parts of the marketing mix are showing to be more effective.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question next, and this may be our final question because we're getting short on time, but this is a question for Mary Muth, and this is, could companies be asked to put the CFBAI seal on product packaging to help guide parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. And putting the CFBAI seal on products would be one way to distinguish the healthier products from the less healthy products. The concerns might be that product labels are already fairly crowded, and whether or not it would be viewable, and also whether or not consumers would actually understand its meaning. So it could be one potential avenue, but it would also require a lot of education of consumers about what it actually means, and so that it would actually then influence purchase behavior.
Okay, excellent. I think that may be the last question that we have time for today. I wanted to let other folks know if you've had questions in the chat, we will try to respond and post some of those answers along with the recording of the webinar. So we'll get back to you on some of those if we can. But I want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers today for a fantastic program. You can really see by how many questions it generated just how great the interest was in today's panel, and we really thank you for being part of it. I want to go next to a few announcements from NCCOR, and then we'll close out for today. For our announcements, I wanted to say first that we would invite you to please visit NCCOR for other research articles, for the latest research, and you can find that information at ncor.org/research-articles. So again, ncor.org/research articles, and there's a hyphen in research articles. If you would like to assess your program's impact, we also have some information that you may be interested in on the NCCOR website. You can find our toolkit for evaluating childhood healthy weight programs there, and that is available at ncor.org/NCCOR-tools. If you are a student, we also have things for you on our website. You can sign up for our NCCOR student newsletter at ncor.org/e-newsletter. That's e-newsletter, ncor.org/e-newsletter. And you can also check out our Student Hub webpage with a lot of good information that you may be interested in. Also, I want to add that whether you are a student or a professional, if you have used any of NCCOR's tools, we would like to know. So please email us at ncor@fhi360.org, and we may feature you in an upcoming webinar. If you have any other questions for NCCOR, about NCCOR or about our upcoming activities, please contact the NCCOR Coordinating Center. And again, that email address is ncor@fhi360.org. I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists today and to all of you in the audience. We appreciate you joining us today and hope that you will enjoy the rest of your day and join us next time. If you have any further questions, please send us an email, ncor@fhi360.org, and you can contact the NCCOR Coordinating Center there. Thank you so much, and we'll see you the next time. Take care.